Today we're going to talk about pitch perception and then get into auditory scene analysis, all right? So one of the really remarkable things about the sense of hearing is that most natural sounds contain many different frequencies, and yet they sound like one thing, okay? So in particular, voices and instruments, among other sounds, tend to produce frequencies that are harmonics of a fundamental frequency, okay? And so what that means is that the frequencies in the sound are integer multiples of a fundamental frequency. So here's just an example. This is a schematic power spectrum, so we've got amplitude here, and this is frequency in hertz, but the harmonics here are labeled by their harmonic number, okay? And that's because the frequencies that are in this sound have this very regular pattern to them, right? So we've got the fundamental frequency down here, and 2 times that, 3 times that, 4 times that, all the way up, okay? So on a linear frequency scale, these things are regularly spaced. So these are harmonics, okay? And so typically when we talk about the sounds having a pitch, usually refers to the fact that they're harmonic, and the pitch is thought to be like the perceptual correlate of that fundamental frequency, all right? So if you're playing a musical instrument, and you're varying the pitch of the notes, what you're doing is varying the fundamental frequency of the notes. And that could be because you're varying the string length, for instance, or something else inside the instrument, okay? All right, so I was just playing you an excerpt of a tune called Summer Madness by Kool and the Gang. And I always like showing this when we talk about pitch because this has these very prominent octave jumps, okay? So an octave is a ratio of 2. And so when you have 2 notes that are separated by an octave, that means that the fundamental frequency differs by a factor of 2. And then you can see all of the harmonics kind of stretch. And so we can just look at that one more time. Okay. So here's our live spectrogram, and this is Kool and the Gang. Okay, and so what you hopefully saw, right, is that after each one of those intervals, right, the harmonics kind of all doubled, right? So the fundamental frequency doubled, and then and as a consequence of that, the spacing between the harmonics doubled, right? Okay, so that's the nature of harmonic sounds, and so. Sounds can have the same fundamental frequency, and you might describe them as having the same pitch despite them differing in other ways, okay? So these are, again, schematic power spectra of 6 different sounds that all have the same fundamental frequency despite having very different harmonic amplitudes. So we've got a piano, a trombone, tenor sax, and then 3 spoken vowels, all right? And so you can see that the lowest frequency is the same across all of these sounds, and then the spacing between the frequencies they contain is the same, right? So they got the same harmonic series, but they've been passed through different filters, and we're at the end of the lecture, we're going to talk about timbre. So these sounds, we would all describe it as having different timbres, but they've got the same fundamental frequency, or F0. So another kind of important concept is that the fundamental frequency, it determines the period of the sound, even when it's not physically present, all right? So this is a sound that has a missing fundamental, okay? And it consists of the second, the third, and the fourth harmonic of 250 hertz, okay? So the second harmonic of 250 hertz is 500 hertz, so twice that. Third harmonic is 750, and the fourth is 1,000, okay? And so you can see that within this period of the sound, the 500 hertz component has 2 cycles, okay? The 750 component has 3 cycles, and the 1,000 hertz component has 4 cycles, okay? Now, if you add them all together to get the sound that this would correspond to, this is the waveform, okay? So this is the sum of these 3 sinusoids. And it's got some funny shape. But you can see that the period of the sound, so the time interval over which the sound exerts one cycle after which it repeats, is 4 milliseconds, okay? Which is 1 over the fundamental frequency of 250 hertz, okay? So the fundamental frequency of this sound is 250 hertz, even though the sound does not actually contain any power at 250 hertz, right? So that 250 hertz component is missing physically from the sound. Okay? So the fundamental frequency is sort of a more abstract notion. It describes the repetition rate of the sound. Okay? And so the classical notion of pitch is that it is the perceptual analog of the fundamental frequency, or F0. And we typically think that sounds that have the same periodicity, which equivalently means they have the same F0, usually share the pitch. So here are some examples. So here's a pure tone. Okay, here's a harmonic complex tone. So this harmonic complex tone has the fundamental frequency that's equal to the frequency of the pure tone, but then it's got all these other harmonics on top of it, okay? And so the waveforms, which are shown here, look really different. But when you listen to them, you might think there's something they have in common. Now in the bottom, it's that same harmonic complex, but without the fundamental component, okay? So the fundamental frequency of the sound is still that same F0, but the F0 is now physically missing from the sound. All right, so you can tell that those sounds are not exactly the same, but there's some quality that they have in common, and we would often call that quality the pitch. Okay, so why does pitch matter? Well, it's a diagnostic property of some sounds, and for some familiar sounds, you know what their pitch is, okay? And voices are a good example of this. So this is a demo where I have a recording of a person whose voice probably all of you are fairly familiar with, and then I have pitch shifted it artificially, okay? So I'm going to play you the pitch shifted versions, all right, and then we'll play you the correct version. Raise your hand. Don't say who you think this is, but raise your hand if you think you can tell who this is.
There are a lot of points I want to make tonight, but the most important one.
Okay, so a couple of you know. All right, let's play the really low one.
There are a lot of points I want to make tonight, but the most important one.
Okay, let's go a little closer to the true pitch.
There are a lot of points I want to make tonight, but the most important one.
There are a lot of points I want to make tonight, but the most important one.
All right, how many people know who that is? Raise your hand. All right, a few of you. Okay, but then here's the correct one.
There are a lot of points I want to make tonight, but the most important one is that 20 years ago I became the luckiest man on earth because Michelle Obama agreed to marry me.
All right, so that's our former president, okay? And I think probably you would agree that it's a little more recognizable when it's played at the correct pitch. And even those of you who could recognize that that was Barack Obama could probably tell that the pitch was not correct, right? So you sort of know like what the pitch is of like sort of familiar voices, okay? This is kind of a cool experiment that actually shows that you rely on pitch to recognize voices. So this was an experiment conducted by Melinda McPherson, a former graduate student here, who measured the ability to recognize celebrity voices. So she took all these recordings of famous people, did an experiment where participants heard excerpts of these people talking, and those excerpts could either be played at the original pitch or that could be pitch shifted up or down by up to an octave in either direction, all right? People would hear the excerpt and then they would type in who they thought it was, and that was coded, all right? And so this graph plots percent correct recognition as a function of the pitch shift, okay? And so you can see that when it's not shifted at all, people are recognizing a little over 50% of the celebrities, and that's just because like lots of celebrities only some people know because not everybody watches the same TV shows and stuff like that, right? But as you shift the pitch, the recognition drops fairly precipitously, okay? And even a pitch shift of 3 semitones, that's a quarter of an octave, is enough to give you a deficit. So it's also often the case that information is conveyed by the way that pitch changes over time. And so that's certainly also very important in pitch and also in music. So Prosody is the word that we use to refer to the pitch changes that occur in music. They often convey emotion and emphasis. So here's a particular example.
903!
Okay, so that's a person who is saying a number that doesn't have any particular emotional content, but you can tell they're really excited. Conversely,
December 4th.
that person is really sad. They're just saying a date. But importantly, if we just shift the pitch up, all right, so the pitch gets much higher, you can still kind of hear the emotion in their voice because it's conveyed by the way the pitch is changing over time.
903!
Or,
December 4th.
okay. So that's relative pitch. All right, so classically, like the problem of pitch perception has been construed as trying to understand how the brain estimates the F0 of a sound from its harmonics, okay? And part of the idea of that is that like a sound that has an F0 is harmonic. It consists of these different frequency components. And the ear, we often think of the ear as kind of doing a frequency analysis of a sound, right? So the sound comes into the ear, it's just a waveform, right? But it contains these discrete frequency components, and the ear is kind of doing an analysis of the frequency content, right? And so you might think that the ear kind of takes that sound, takes it apart into these constituent frequencies, and then you have to determine the properties of the sound, one of which is the fundamental frequency. All right, and so one kind of key idea in all of this is that the information that we have about the harmonics in the sound is limited by the frequency resolution of the cochlea. So what's shown here is a schematic power spectrum of a harmonic sound. This is a harmonic sound that's actually missing the fundamental, but you have all of the other harmonics. And this is a schematic of the filters that we kind of think of as being in your cochlea, okay? So remember how when we learned about the filters in your cochlea, we talked about how in absolute terms, the filters at the low end of the cochlea, so actually at the apex, but tuned to low frequencies, those tend to be narrower in hertz. And then as you move up the spectrum, the filters get wider, all right? And that's what's shown here. So down here at the low end, the filters are narrow and they get wider as you move up the spectrum, okay? So let's think about the representation of this harmonic sound when passed through these filters. So what's shown at the top is what's called an excitation pattern. Think of this as like the magnitude of the response at each place along the cochlea, okay? And you can see that you get these peaks and valleys here down at the apical end of the cochlea in response to some of the individual frequency components. But you can also see that those peaks and valleys kind of peter out, right? And so the higher numbered harmonics, you don't produce these discernible peaks and valleys. So why is this? Well, let's think about the interactions of these harmonics with the filters, okay? So this is harmonics 2 and 3. Harmonics 2 and 3 are actually quite widely spaced compared to the cochlear filter bank. And so the consequence is that they kind of hit different filters. And so there's, in particular, in between them, there's sort of a filter that there's another filter there. That's the purple one, right? And so you get a peak and a trough there, right? And so that's true for like a lot of these low-numbered harmonics. So we often call these harmonics resolved because they kind of produce these discernible peaks in the excitation pattern of the cochlea. By contrast, if you look up here at the high-numbered harmonics, you've got like two filters here that are kind of separated by the same number of hertz, right? And so they have the same separation relative to the harmonics, but they're much broader, right? And so now the filters up there at the high end are kind of looking at a whole bunch of harmonics at once, okay? And so the consequence is that the responses of different filters actually varies quite minimally, okay? So even though like, you have a harmonic here and a harmonic here, there's very little variation in the response, okay? And so this regime is classically referred to as being unresolved, right? So you're not able to resolve the individual components because of the coarseness of the tuning of the filter. All right, so this is that same kind of concept depicted in a different picture. So now we've got like the power spectrum up top, pass through the filter bank, you get the excitation pattern. The addition here is now for different places along the cochlea, we're looking at the basilar membrane vibration over time. Okay. All right, and there's a few important things about this picture. So the first thing to note is that down here at the apical end of the cochlea, where it's tuned to low frequencies, if you look at a place that's kind of being stimulated by a single harmonic, you can see that the basilar membrane vibration is dominated by that harmonic. It looks like a sinusoid, right? So in this sense, the cochlea is really picking out that one low-numbered harmonic. Okay? Here's another place a little ways up. It's the same kind of thing. But if you move a little ways up further, what you're seeing is a response that's no longer purely sinusoidal, right? In fact, there's amplitude modulation. Anybody remember what we call that? Beating, yeah. So we're getting some beating, right? Remember, beating happens whenever there are two frequency components that are getting passed through the same. So we hear beating, and it gets registered by the ear whenever they pass through the same filter, okay? And that causes amplitude modulation. So that's what you're seeing. So this is beating in the response of the ear to the sound. And then as we move up the spectrum, the beating becomes more and more pronounced because there are more and more harmonics that are essentially making it through the same filter. Okay. So up here at the basal end of the cochlea, when you're responding to high frequencies, the harmonics are unresolved in the sense that the pattern of excitation along the cochlea is undifferentiated, but you do have this big temporal signal here. And in fact, the beating here happens at the fundamental frequency. So this has got the same period as the original sound. Okay, so big picture is that there's sort of these two cues that pop out of these kinds of diagrams as being plausible sources of information about the fundamental frequency of a sound. One is what are called place cues. So these are the peaks and valleys in the excitation pattern. And the other are timing cues here, right, which exist even for these high unresolved harmonics. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you a fact about pitch perception. Okay, and one very salient fact is that pitch discrimination turns out to be better in humans when resolved harmonics are present in the sound. Okay? And so you can do an experiment where you vary the harmonics that are present in a sound, and you can measure discrimination thresholds. So that would be like the just noticeable difference in fundamental frequency. It's like how much you have to increase the pitch for somebody to tell that it went up or down. Okay? So that's what's plotted here on the y-axis. This is the fundamental frequency difference that is the threshold for a bunch of humans. Okay? There are two different frequency ranges, which for our purposes doesn't really matter. And then the critical variable here is what's plotted on the x-axis, which is the lowest harmonic number in the stimulus. Okay? And so if the lowest harmonic number is 3, that means that that stimulus contains harmonics 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, up to some large number. If the lowest harmonic number is 10, that means that you start with the 10th harmonic, and you have 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Okay? And so what is evident from this results graph is that thresholds tend to be pretty good when the stimulus includes low-numbered harmonics. And then as you start to lose those low-numbered harmonics, so when the lowest harmonic number is 8 or 10 or 12 or 15, the thresholds increase. Okay? All right, so here's a demo of that. So this is an example trial from an experiment. And so on this particular experiment, there are 3 stimuli, and you have to say which of them has a different pitch from the others. Okay, so let's start with something easy. One, 2, or 3? 3, good, okay. So this was a stimulus that contained resolved harmonics, okay? So I'm not gonna go through the details of exactly how these stimuli were made, but they're passed through a filter and manipulated so that you've either got low-numbered harmonics or that are resolved, thought to be resolved, or high-numbered harmonics that we call unresolved. Okay, so that's a 10% difference in fundamental frequency. So just for comparison, a semitone, which is like the difference between adjacent white and black keys on a piano, that's about 6%. Okay, so 10% is, in musical terms, is like pretty substantial. Okay, and so we expect you to be able to hear that difference, because if you couldn't, you wouldn't really be able to recognize a lot of melodies. Okay, so that's for the resolved harmonics. Here's the same thing, but when the harmonics are unresolved, and it'll probably be harder for you to tell which one is different. Which one? Yeah, I think that's right, but it's a little harder. Now let's go down to 2%. Which one is different? Okay, but that was obviously a little bit harder, but now let's try it with the unresolved. Yeah, so that's pretty hard. Okay, so you're all normal, which is to say your pitch discrimination is better when you have low-numbered harmonics, right? So that's just sort of this fact about human hearing. Okay, so the standard inference from that result is that it is suggestive that pitch perception involves some form of spectral pattern recognition, right? So the fact that you're better when the stimulus contains these low-numbered harmonics suggests that these peaks and valleys are kind of part of what is being recognized when you're detecting the pitch, okay? And in this regime up here, where the harmonics are unresolved and all you have is that temporal response, that's where pitch perception is worse. You don't have that spectral pattern information, and so that seems to be important. Okay. All right, so it's often like, we see these phenomena in perception, and then it's natural to wonder like why things are the way that they are, right? And so some of the new tools that we have at our disposal due to the advances of machine learning give us some new ways to kind of investigate some of these questions about why things are the way that they are, right? And so one of the things that we can do to try to understand the nature of human perception is to optimize machine systems to solve what we think are some of the same problems that human perceptual systems are designed to solve. And then we can look at whether they do what people do and under what conditions, okay? So this is a model that was optimized to estimate the fundamental frequency of excerpts of speech or music superimposed on noise. So there's a model of the Cochlear and then a convolutional neural network. And so the model is trained to do this, and then you can simulate experiments on the model and ask whether the model exhibits the same kind of characteristics that are seen in humans. Okay. So this is a results graph from human pitch perception that just summarizes what we saw earlier. So what's being plotted here is the F0 discrimination threshold, so that's your pitch discrimination threshold. So down is better, up is worse, as a function of the lowest harmonic number. Okay? And so what this shows is that when the lowest harmonic number is low, the discrimination thresholds are pretty good, i.e. small, and then as the lowest harmonic number increases, they get worse. There's also this phase manipulation here that is not terribly relevant for our purposes. Okay? And this is the model when you run it on a similar experiment. You can see that qualitatively you get a similar kind of result, that the model has low discrimination thresholds, i.e. good discrimination thresholds in this regime where you have low-numbered harmonics, and then they get worse. Okay. So this suggests that this particular performance characteristic sort of emerges as a consequence of optimizing a system to estimate fundamental frequency. Now, of course, it doesn't tell you why that happens, but with the model, you can do experiments that would be difficult to do in biology. And in particular, you can ask whether the perceptual characteristics that are observed depend on like the auditory diet that the system is optimized for. Okay? So the results that I just showed you came from a model that was trained on excerpts of speech or music, so natural or naturalistic sounds. Okay? One of the most salient features of natural sounds is that they tend to be low pass. They tend to have more power at low frequencies than high frequencies, and that's evident here. So this is a graph that shows a power spectrum, so the y-axis is power, the x-axis is frequency. The black line is the average spectrum of speech or music stimuli. And so you can see they have a fair amount of power at low frequencies, and then it drops off. Okay? And so what was done in this study is to create new sounds, either by filtering speech or music or by generating synthetic tones that have particular spectral properties, right? So that they were either low pass or high pass. Right? So high pass sounds instead have more power at higher frequencies. So you can take these new auditory diets and then optimize systems to estimate fundamental frequency under these different conditions. And what was found is that you get very different psychophysical results on these models that are optimized on different kinds of sounds. Okay, and so this is that same experiment. So again, we have F0 discrimination thresholds as a function of the lowest harmonic number. So the black curve is the one that you get if you train the model on natural sounds. And then if you filter the sounds to either be even more low pass or high pass, you get like very different results curves. And here, if you take synthetic sounds, if you match the spectrum of the synthetic sounds to these natural sounds, you get the black curve out, which again sort of looks qualitatively human-like. And then if you do these anti-match sounds where they're instead high pass, you get kind of the opposite sort of pattern. Okay? So this is sort of suggesting that the dependence of human pitch perception on these low-numbered harmonics is because kind of that's where the information is in natural sounds about fundamental frequency. In the sense that if you take a machine system, you train it to estimate fundamental frequency, that's the information that it ends up learning to use. Okay? And if you train it on different kinds of sounds, it develops a different strategy. All right. What questions do you have about that? Okay, so big picture is we can take machine learning models and optimize them for biological problems and then look at what they do, right? And what you can do with these machine learning models that you can't do with actual biological systems is you can optimize them for different kinds of worlds, right? Kind of think of this as like simulating evolution and development in alternative worlds where the nature of sounds is very different. So it can kind of give you a glimpse of like what might we be like if we had evolved and grown up in a very different kind of world. Okay? And in this particular case, it suggests that our pitch perception would be different. So it gives us one way to sort of understand why we have these particular traits that we do. Okay, so let's talk very briefly about where all this might be happening in the brain. So this is a cross-section of the head showing you the key components of the auditory system. So we've got these different subcortical way stations and then auditory cortex here in the temporal lobe. So this is a view of the macaque brain from the side. And auditory cortex is kind of mostly buried inside a sulcus. And so to view it, you typically kind of cut out a piece of the brain. And it's very common to distinguish in the cortex between three regions: the core, the belt that kind of goes around it, and then the parabelt. And these different regions are kind of distinguished in part by different response properties, but also by their connections, right? So this is a crude diagram that kind of denotes different areas and their connections. So this thing in the middle here is the core, and that's conventionally thought to consist of three regions. And then surrounded by the belt and then the parabelt. Now, one of the kind of key things that you see when you look at the auditory cortex is what's known as tonotopy. And that refers to the fact that there is a map of frequency selectivity. So this is a picture that is the result of an fMRI experiment where people are in an fMRI scanner and they're listening to pure tones. And the pure tones vary in their frequency. So what an fMRI scanner does is it measures a signal from the brain that is believed to be related to neural activity. So you can then analyze the results, and for every little piece of the brain, you can ask which frequency caused it to respond the most. And so that's turned into a map here where the voxels, or the little pieces of brain, are color-coded based on the frequency that caused the biggest response. So very low, best frequencies would be dark blue, and very high would be red. And so what you see when you do an experiment like this is typically this kind of gradient where you see a stripe here where the best frequency is high, and then it kind of transitions to the best frequency being low, and then it switches back again to the best frequency being high. Okay. So it's a very prominent kind of functional anatomical thing that you see in the auditory cortex. Now, it's not totally clear like why this is there and why it's important. I mean, it's sort of essentially recapitulating the tonotopy that you see as early as the cochlea, but it's there. Yeah.
Is this the fMRI scan of the cock brain? Or?
No, this is a human. Yeah. Yeah. And so I would say, although it's not totally clear why this is particularly interesting or important, it's there. And it's there in everybody, and it pretty much always looks pretty much the same. So everybody's got a map like this. It's more or less always in the same place. Yeah.
Is there like a pattern to it that I'm not seeing?
High, low, high. So high is red, low is blue, high is red. So that's the stereotyped pattern that you see when you do the experiment, right? And then the high regions sort of come close to connecting at the top. Right? Okay. So, one of the reasons why this is worth knowing about is because it's there and it's because it's prominent. It's also worth knowing about because scientifically it turns out to be a fairly useful landmark. So oftentimes we will measure tonotopy as a reference point, and it's useful to kind of compare other responses that you might observe in the auditory cortex to that tonotopic map. Okay? And so one of the places where this turns out to be sort of useful is when we think about the neural basis of pitch. So one approach that has been used for a long time to try to isolate parts of the brain that process pitch is to look for regions that respond more to tones than to noise. And that's what's shown in the top plots. So we have the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and these are probabilistic maps of the likelihood that a voxel will significantly respond more to tones, so harmonic tones, than to noise. Right? And so you see these regions that have that property. Right? And so at the bottom part, the borders of that region are compared to that tonotopic map that we just looked at. So again, we've got high, low, high. Okay? And you can see that this region that is responding more to tones than to noise, that a lot of people have hypothesized is involved in pitch perception, overlaps with the low frequency part of the tonotopic map and then kind of extends beyond it. Okay? So again, the reasons why this is where it is are not well understood. But it's a regularity that is there and is kind of interesting. All right, so what is the evidence that this thing is actually involved in pitch perception? Well, I just told you about how pitch perception seems to be dominated by low-numbered harmonics in the sense that your discrimination thresholds are best, they're lowest, when the stimulus contains low-numbered harmonics. Okay? And so it turns out that if you measure the response of this brain region as a function of the harmonic composition of tones that people are listening to, the response is largest when the tones contain low-numbered harmonics. So what these graphs are plotting is the fMRI response measured as percent signal change, that's on the y-axis, for different stimulus conditions that vary in the lowest harmonic number. Okay? And again, there's two different frequency ranges, and it's not critical for our purposes. And what you can see is that when the stimulus contains low-numbered harmonics up to maybe the eighth, you get a higher response, and then after that it kind of drops off. And so these two graphs, they sort of look like the flip of these two graphs. Right? So the response of the brain is high whenever the discrimination thresholds are low, that is, they're good, and the response gets lower whenever discrimination is worse. Okay? And so the fact that there's this relationship between this stimulus parameter that affects perception is consistent with the idea that this brain region is involved in some way in mediating the perception of pitch. Okay. Yeah?
Why is it higher for the high frequency ranges for the
Say that louder.
Why is it higher for the high frequency ranges?
You mean why does this go up a little bit higher? I don't know. And if you squint, maybe it looks like there's a similar effect here perceptually. This might just be a fluke. I mean, it's real data, so we don't expect them to be exactly the same. I'm not sure if that's worth writing home about or not. Yeah, it's a good question. What other questions you got? All right, we're going to talk about timbre now. So the last thing we're going to talk about before we get into auditory scene analysis is timbre, okay? So timbre is sort of, it's frustrating because on the one hand, it's like it's maybe the most interesting thing about sound. On the other hand, it's sort of defined as what a whole bunch of things leave out, right? So it's classically defined as the other dimension in addition to loudness and pitch, along which our perception of sounds can vary, okay? And it's pretty clearly not just one dimension, but the number of dimensions is unclear. It's not really even clear how to think about it. But it's nonetheless a thing that people talk about a lot, and it references lots of things that are important. So classically, like timbre is like the thing that differentiates different instruments, right? So here, this is an example. We got a piano note, a trombone note, and a tenor sax note, right? And the fundamental frequencies are all the same. So classically and musically, we would say that they have the same pitch. They're the same note, okay? But they sound really different, okay? So what is it that determines timbre? And one factor that determines timbre is the relative amplitude of overtones. And so this is a kind of a cool demo that shows how different overtones contribute to timbre. So listen to this.
Effect of spectrum on timbre. You will hear the sounds of two instruments built up by adding partials one at a time.
Okay, so the point of that, right, is that thing initially didn't sound like what it sounded like at the end, right? And then we add in those frequency components, and you kind of build up this sense of what it is. And here's the same thing here. So hopefully you had the experience that gradually kind of became more and more of a realistic rendition of a guitar being plucked, right? So the timbre, the sense of what the instrument is, it's some operation that's being performed on the entire sound, and the relative amplitudes of the different overtones is sort of part of the story, okay? But another kind of interesting fact, just at least about musical instruments, is that the high and the low tones from a musical instrument, they generally have different amplitude spectra. And what I mean by that is that like the shape of the spectrum is distinct. It's not the case that you kind of can take the amplitude spectrum of like of a very low note and just translate that up and end up with a high note that sounds like that instrument, right? So for instance, on the piano, the low notes will typically have a lot more energy in the high overtones, whereas the high notes have a lot more energy at the fundamental. And so the consequence of this, like I said, is if you take one note, played on an instrument, and simply scale all the frequencies up or down, it doesn't sound like the same instrument. So this is a classic demonstration of this effect. Okay, so check this out.
Change in timbre with transposition. A 3-octave scale on a bassoon is presented, followed by a 3-octave scale of notes that are simple transpositions of the instrument's highest tone. This is how the bassoon would sound if all its tones had the same relative spectrum.
So hopefully you can tell that in that version, really, it's only the high notes that actually kind of sound like the bassoon. All right. So the low notes have that same spectrum as the high note, but just transposed down, and your brain has learned that that's not what a bassoon that's not what a bassoon sounds like. Right. So The basis for that kind of effect is still kind of not known. It's probably learned from exposure to instruments, but we don't really know. And really, I should say that the reason why the bassoon has that acoustic property, I think, is fairly straightforward, which is that a lot of instruments have a relatively fixed filter. So the body of the instrument is this thing that's constant, and then it's excited with a sound that can vary in fundamental frequency. But because the filter is fixed, the kind of shape of the sound ends up being sort of constant in some sense, but then you're varying the fundamental frequency, and that causes the relative amplitudes of the different harmonics to kind of change depending on the pitch of the note. But how you actually learn that that's how instruments do their thing is unclear. So another stimulus property that influences timbre is the envelope of a sound. So that refers to the way that the intensity changes over time. So this can be really different for something that's plucked versus struck or blown. So these are waveforms of two notes played on a violin. In the first one, it's plucked. So when you pluck the string, you get this very rapid increase in energy that kind of slowly decays. Whereas when you bow a string, there's a slow buildup, and then it's kind of more sustained as the bow travels across the string. And so the importance of the envelope can be seen by playing things backwards, because the amplitude spectrum is unchanged when you play things backwards. And so if you've ever played around with playing sounds backwards, you'll know that they sound kind of funny. And here's an example.
Effect of tone envelope on timbre. You will hear a recording of a Bach chorale played on a piano.
Okay, now what they did, this is a really old demo, and so they got a very talented musician to play the Bach chorale backwards. They recorded that, and then they time reversed the tape. Okay, so now you have the Bach chorale where all of the notes are in the correct order, but each note is actually the time reversal of what it's supposed to be in. So it sounds pretty funny.
Now the tape of the last recording is played backwards so that the chorale is heard forward again, but with an interesting difference.
All right, you get the idea. All right, so that's the piano played backwards. Doesn't sound at all like a piano anymore, right? And so obviously, music producers use effects like this now in modern times all the time to kind of create psychedelic effects and things like that. Right, so the amplitude envelope matters a lot. Another kind of, there's all kinds of really interesting timbral effects with voices. And in general, a lot of people will often say that musical instruments are intended to mimic voices. And in some contexts, maybe that's true. But voices do a lot of things that musical instruments often don't. And in particular, typically, the fundamental frequency of the voice will change fairly rapidly over time. Certainly that happens in speech, and often when people sing, if there's any kind of vibrato. And so that turns out to be this very distinctive thing that kind of makes something sound like a voice. Let's look at the spectrogram.
Demonstration 24. Role of frequency micromodulation on voice perception. This demonstration is quite complex. Please refer to the booklet for a complete explanation. First we hear a pure tone. Then it is joined by other partials that could make up a vowel. Our perception is that the pure tone continues on, accompanied by a rich one. Finally, when an identical vibrato is added to all the harmonics, the sounds fuse and a sung vowel emerges. This sequence is heard for 3 different vowels.
Okay, I think that's enough. You get the idea. But it's quite striking, right? So you get this thing that goes from sounding like a synthetic tone to something that really sounds kind of voice-like, because you've learned to associate vibrato with that, presumably. Okay. What questions you got about timbre?
I'm kind of curious how the effect of like, I'm not sure whether to call it like reverb, but like the effect of like the space that the sound exists has on timbre. I'm thinking like with the saxophone, sometimes if you play with a different mouthpiece, it will be described as having like a brassier timbre or like a non-brassy timbre.
Yeah. Well, that, I mean, would you describe that as, that's not about the space, that's like just you're changing the instrument, right?
But I guess, yeah, like the place where like the sound first comes in.
Yeah. I mean, again, you can think about this in a lot of different ways, but I mean, you are changing the sound, right? It's going to probably filter the sound in different ways. And, you know, what the question is, you know, why does that make it feel different, right? Like, why do we associate those sounds with sort of like, I don't know, different emotional emphasis or something, right? And it's you know, it's not totally clear, right? I mean, some people would say that like the emotional associations that you have with timbre maybe derived from experience with voices, you know, that you hear people vocalizing under different emotional conditions, and then some instrument effects kind of are trying to mimic that. That's possible and probably true to some extent, you know. But yeah, it's always a little hard to say, right? So yeah, so timbre, it's very yeah, it's a lot of fun to listen to. It's hard to talk about, and yeah, often hard to think about, but yeah.
I guess you preempted my question a bit, but has anyone tried to subdivide timbre into like things aside from like what we just discussed about like envelope and stuff?
Not really. So the main thing that's been done is there's been a fair bit of work on instrument sounds where you can do things like ask people to rate the similarity of different instrument sounds. And then there's analyses that you can do to try to figure out what are the main dimensions that determine the variation in similarity. And the main thing that kind of comes out of that are really sort of two main dimensions. One is the speed of the attack. So it's kind of like how abrupt the amplitude envelope is. So that's like one of the things that we talked about. And then the other is like the spectral centroid, so how bright or dull the sound is. Okay, so some sounds have a lot more energy at high frequencies, some have a lot more energy at low frequencies. So that's kind of what comes out of that. And it's always a little underwhelming because, like, you know, you listen to instruments and they're so much fun to listen to, and it feels very rich, right? And obviously when you listen to a musician, you can hear all kinds of stuff about how they're playing, right? So there's a lot more to it. But yeah, that's the main thing that's been done. Yeah.
Besides bright and dull, how do people describe timbre, especially like in the science fields?
Yeah, they don't. I mean, yeah, there's like, so we talk about, you know, brightness and sharpness. There's a very small number of words, right? So yeah, there's sharpness, there's roughness. That's kind of how amplitude modulated something is. So if a sound has got a lot of amplitude modulation in a certain range, we'll call it rough because it kind of sounds rough. Yeah, people just make stuff up, and different people will use different words, and they're inconsistent in how to use them and stuff. It's like, it's hard to talk about these things, right? Yeah, so it's sort of interesting that it's not very well connected to language, you know. Yeah. Okay. Last thing we'll talk about here is intensity and loudness. Okay, so loudness is like this other very like obvious property of sound, right? Some sounds are quiet, some sounds are loud. It's a very important thing to actually understand because it's one of the main things that people complain about, right? So, you know, you're living in a city and there's too much noise, right? And so you complain to the authorities, and then they're supposed to do something. And so in order to do that, they need to be able to measure or estimate the loudness, right? So there's, or if you're a car manufacturer, right, people will complain if the car is too loud, and so you want to be able to model and predict how loud the car noise is. Okay, and so this is something that's been the subject of like quite a bit of research. In the very early days of psychophysics, there was a lot of work done on what's called magnitude estimation. Okay, where there would be people do these experiments where they'd play people, in this case a sound, and they'd ask them to rate how loud it is, just using a number. Okay? And so the person who kind of most is associated with this approach is S.S. Stevens, who is a psychophysicist who was working at Harvard like in the 40s. Okay? And the conclusion of these experiments is that loudness can be described as a power law. Okay? So the loudness that someone will ascribe to a sound is proportional to the physical intensity of the sound raised to a power of approximately 0.3. Okay? It's an empirical fact. So if you have sound intensity on this axis and the magnitude estimation on this axis, you get a lawful relationship. Okay? So what's significant about this? Well, again, this tends to be fairly consistent across people, and you can use this to sort of predict the extent to which a change in sound level that you could measure in decibels would translate to a change in loudness. And so what that formula tells us is that a 10 decibel increase in the level of a sound will give approximately a doubling in loudness. Okay? So if you go from something that's 60 dB to something that's 70 dB, it should sound about twice as loud. Okay? And that's because when you have a 10 dB increase in level, that's a 10-fold increase in intensity. And so 10 to the power of 0.3 is about 2. Okay? All right, so that's just sort of a useful rule of thumb to sort of know about. Okay, so that's one fact that's kind of worth knowing, I think, about loudness and intensity. Another fact that is worth knowing about is something that we talked a little bit about earlier in the class, and that is that it's kind of interesting that people can discriminate intensities quite well over this enormous dynamic range. Okay? And so this is something that, again, has been measured quite a lot. This is one example. So this is a graph that is plotting the intensity discrimination threshold in decibels as a function of the intensity of the sounds. Okay? So 0 here, this is an SPL, dB SPL. All right? So remember, that's relative to this reference that's thought to be close to the threshold of hearing. So 0 dB SPL basically is like just what you can just barely hear. Okay? So when you get down to these really low stimulus intensities, the thresholds are not so good. But then once you're above about 20 dB SPL, all the way up to 85, the thresholds are kind of less than 1 decibel. Okay? All right, so this is, again, it's just sort of a fact about what people can discriminate, right? Intensity resolution is pretty good. And so one of the reasons that people have thought this is interesting is that if you look in the nervous system, and in particular in the auditory nerve, most auditory nerve fibers have narrow dynamic ranges. So what that means is that if you measure the response of a nerve fiber, in this case this is spikes per second, as a function of the intensity of a stimulus, in this case is the tone at the characteristic frequency, what happens is that, well, when the intensity is too low, you just get the spontaneous rate of the fiber, okay? And then at some point you get a threshold, right? And that means that the response starts to increase. But then at some point you saturate, right? It's sort of like that's the highest intensity over which the response will change. And so what you can see here is that here the threshold of the tone is maybe about 30 decibels, and then it's saturating here at maybe, I don't know, 50 or 55, right? So that's a fairly narrow dynamic range of maybe 25, 30 dB. Okay? So it gets a little more complicated because if you look at the auditory nerve, there tend to be these different types of fibers. Okay? So some of the fibers are like this one, where the dynamic range is fairly narrow and the spontaneous rate is high. So on its own, without any sound stimulation, the neuron is spiking around 30 spikes per second. Okay? You also have nerve fibers that have lower spontaneous rates and that have a wider dynamic range. Okay? And a fact about the auditory nerve. Okay, so the puzzle here, right, is that we seem to be able to register and discriminate intensities over this enormous range from all the way down here to all the way up, like above here, right? But the nerve fibers only change their response over a fairly narrow range. All right, so the question is, well, once the nerve fiber is saturated, like the response isn't changing if you increase the stimulus beyond that. And so how could you tell that the intensity was continuing to go up? Okay. All right, so that's what's called the dynamic range problem. It's sort of a well-known thing people have puzzled about. And there's a handful of solutions that have been proposed over the years. One is what is called off-frequency listening. And so the idea there is that Like, so let's suppose you're discriminating the intensity of a tone at 1 kilohertz. When the intensity gets really high, the nerve fibers that have a characteristic frequency near a kilohertz may be saturated, but the ones that are further away won't be. Okay? And so you could somehow listen to those. All right, so that's off-frequency listening. There's also the notion that you might use temporal information like phase locking. So you see increases in synchrony with levels. Of course, you can only use this when you have phase locking, which is for frequencies that are below 4 kilohertz. And then the other proposal is that these low spontaneous rate fibers might be really important. Okay, so those have higher thresholds but greater dynamic range. And people have wondered about, well, if they're so important, why are they a relatively small proportion of the auditory nerve? Okay. All right, so that's the dynamic range problem. And I would say the solution to this is still something that is not sort of, there's not total consensus about how this works. Okay, so we talked about over the past couple lectures at the properties of individual sounds, right? We describe individual sounds in terms of their loudness, their location, their pitch, their timbre. So all of these are perceptual variables that tell us things about the physical events in the world that produce the sounds, which is presumably the point of hearing them in the first place. Okay? So timbre is the richest, but it's the least defined and the least understood of these dimensions. And what we're going to talk about now is what happens when more than one sound occurs at once, when we have an auditory scene. Okay, before I do that, any questions about loudness or anything else? Yeah.
I have a question about the tonotopy that we saw in the MRI scan.
Yep.
Do you know if there's any stimuli that produces similar activations in the auditory cortex in deaf individuals?
So you're asking, is there a way to activate this bit of cortex in someone who's deaf? Yeah, so I think that the standard thinking on someone who lacks a sense, so deaf or blind, is that the cortex that's normally allocated that sense tends to kind of get repurposed, right?
So like what kind of stimuli would activate, like produce like similar activations, I guess?
Well, I don't know what would produce similar activations, but I think like it seemed, I'm not sure if this is actually known, but it seems very plausible that in someone who is deaf, that you might get visual stimuli actually activating the auditory cortex. So you often see the reverse thing. So people who are blind, like when they're listening to sounds, like you often get a lot of visual cortex activation that you wouldn't necessarily see in someone who's sighted. All right. So the idea is that the cortex kind of gets repurposed, and you know, there's lots of debate over like, well, what, you know, exactly what can the cortex be repurposed for, and I think that's sort of unresolved. But yeah. What other questions you got? Yeah.
Does the loudness estimate depend on the frequency of the sound? Like, are there some frequencies that may appear louder or quieter?
Yes, there are probably small effects of frequency. I mean, obviously, like your detection threshold varies quite a lot depending on frequency, and so you'd want to compensate for that. And once you've compensated for that, there's probably some effects. I don't actually know what they are. The thing that has a bigger effect on loudness is bandwidth, which is on your problem set. Cool. Okay, let's start talking about auditory scene analysis. Okay, so the problem that we're going to be talking about is that many acoustic events happen in the world at once, but your ear only receives one sound wave. Okay? And so the sound wave that is received by your ear is the sum of those that would have been produced by the individual events if they happened on their own. Somehow, the brain has to distinguish the different events that happened in the world from the single signal that it receives. Okay? So for instance, you know, if I'm talking and somebody walks in and you hear the door close, right, you need to be able to distinguish that door closing from my voice because you might want to know whether somebody came in, right? Similarly, like if you're at a restaurant and you're trying to talk to somebody and there's all this noise, you need to be able to distinguish the different sound sources, right? So this happens all the time, and people are really pretty good at it, right? So here's the classic cocktail party version of the problem. So you're talking to somebody, you want to understand this.
She argues with her sister.
But maybe what comes into your ear is this.
She argues with her sister.
Or this.
She argues with her sister.
Or this.
She argues with her sister.
So the presence of the other talkers obscures a lot of the structure in the target utterance, creates this very complicated signal, but the speech remains largely intelligible. And people are still substantially better at this than present-day speech recognition algorithms, although that may not be true for very much longer. All right, so like one interesting perspective on this problem, which is what we talked about in the very first lecture to the class, which is that you can kind of think of the problem that the auditory system is solving as being akin to me giving you this equation and asking you to solve for x. Okay? So that's sort of a ridiculous thing for me to ask you to do. All right, but that's like exactly what's happening at some level, right? Because you're measuring this one signal that is the sum of multiple signals that were generated in the world, and then you're trying to estimate one or more of those one signal, the thing that you're trying to understand. Okay? All right, so this is a classic example of an ill-posed problem. It's ill-posed because there are many combinations of source signals that could add up to be equal to the observed mixture signal. So for every sound wave that the ear receives, there are really an infinite set of sound sources that could have generated it, okay? So it's ill-posed. So as with any ill-posed problem, the brain has to make its best guess as to how many sources there are and what they are based on what it knows about the world. So another kind of fun way to think about this problem is this pictorial description that's normally attributed to Bregman. So imagine the situation here where we got a lake. There's a bunch of boats on the lake. There are these two little inlets that we've carved out of the edge of the lake. And we lay down two handkerchiefs so that the handkerchiefs kind of float on the surface of the water. Okay? And we are allowed to measure the motion of these two handkerchiefs. Okay? And from the motion of the pieces of cloth, the handkerchiefs, we have to determine how many boats are in the lake, where they are in the lake, how big they are, maybe where they're going, stuff like that. Okay? All right, so the analogy here, right, we got two ears. Right, the ears are just measuring vibrations in the air. Those vibrations are originating with sources in the world. Right? So it's kind of amazing. Okay, so how can we do this, right? Well, I think the crux of the issue is that the sounds that we have to hear, the sounds that occur in the real world, are not random. Okay, so this is a brief demonstration of the fact that sounds in the world are not random. So here are some real world sounds. Okay, so those are just sounds that you might hear in your everyday life, okay? Let's compare those to sounds that are random, okay? So I made these sounds to be fully random. So what does that mean? Well, a sound is just a big vector of numbers, right? Where the number at every point in time tells you the pressure at that point in time. So you can make a random sound by randomly sampling each one of those numbers from an independent distribution. I used a Gaussian, I think, okay? All right, so you could do this yourself in Python. So these are fully random sounds. Each sample is an independent draw. Here's what they sound like. Okay. All right, let's listen to another one. All right, let's do it again. Okay. So it's pretty clear that we would have to sit here generating these random sounds for a very, very, very long time before you got a doorbell or a hawk or the sound of toothbrushing. Okay? And so what that tells us is that the sounds that we hear in life are a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of the space of all possible sounds. Okay? And that's really the key to us being able to solve auditory scene analysis. Right? Is that when we describe the problem like this, right? Well, we're giving you this equation with two unknowns, that the fact is that x and y can't take on every possible value, right? Okay. They're like they live in this very, very specific subset of the space of all possible numbers, okay? And so that's what makes the problem solvable, okay? Real world sounds are a very small portion of all possible sounds. Okay, so we talked at the very start of the class of how we often think of perception as unconscious probabilistic inference, right? It's an inference process because the problems are ill-posed, the solution's not uniquely determined, and you have to make your best guess as to what happened in the world to cause a stimulus given what you know about the world. Okay? So that's probabilistic inference, making your best guess. It's unconscious because you're not actually aware of that happening, right? You just end up hearing something or seeing something. This is just kind of happening under the hood. Okay? And the general framework that we use to think about probabilistic inference is Bayes' rule. So here's the setting, right? When we're perceiving something, there is an observation, which is the sensory data that we receive, right? In this case, this is an image. Okay? It could be a sound. So that's the image. There is a set of possible hypotheses for what could have happened in the world to cause the image. Okay? So hypothesis A is that there are these two objects in the world. Okay? One is light green and it's got that funny pattern of stripes. The other is darker green and it's got that curved thing on it. Okay? Hypothesis B is that there are these two objects in the world. There's one surface that is like a two-tone surface, and then there's the letter B. Hypothesis C is that you have that same surface, but now there's a different letter there. Okay. So that's the observation. Now, when we are doing probabilistic inference in this setting, we are trying to find the hypothesis that is most likely given the observation, right? You get sensory data, and you want to figure out what possible state of the world is most likely to have caused that sensory data, okay? And the hypotheses here are different possible states of the world that might have caused that sensory data. All right, so how do we evaluate that probability? Well, this is an expression for that probability. That's what's called the posterior probability, right? It's the probability of the hypothesis given the observation, right? That vertical line means given, okay? And Bayes' rule states that the posterior probability, the probability of A in this case given O, is equal to the product of the probability of A on its own, that's called the prior, and the likelihood, the probability of the observation given the hypothesis. And then it's normalized by the probability of the observation, but typically we're working in a setting where the observation is known, and so that's going to be the same across all possible hypotheses that we consider. Okay, so really the thing that will cause the posterior to vary across hypotheses are the prior and the likelihood. Okay, so let's think through in this simple setting what that would correspond to. Okay, so the prior is a reflection of the fact that some hypotheses are a priori much more likely than others just based on the way the world works. Okay? And so the idea in this simple example is that this hypothesis is a priori not very likely because objects like this tend not to occur in the world. Whereas these two hypotheses have fairly high prior probability, right? This is just sort of a reasonable looking surface, and then the world has lots of letters in it, okay? All right, so the idea is that in this contrived example is that the prior is high for these two and low for that one. Okay, now the likelihood is the probability of the observation given the hypothesis, all right? That's going to tell us to what extent could a hypothesis actually have caused the observation? Okay? And so in this contrived example, the idea is that hypothesis A and B both do a very good job of explaining the observation. Okay? Because if you put these two objects next to each other, or you put the B on top of this, you're going to reproduce pretty much exactly the observed image. Okay? So the likelihood, the probability of this observation given this hypothesis or this hypothesis is high. By comparison, this hypothesis produces fairly low likelihood because it's got the wrong letter, right? So the image that would be created by putting the C on top of this surface is not going to be very similar to that observed image. All right, so the idea is that we're trying to find the hypothesis that gives us a high posterior probability, and that's proportional to the product of the prior and the likelihood, right? So you want the prior to be high, and you also want the likelihood to be high. The prior being high tells you that the hypothesis is reasonable. The likelihood being high tells you that it can explain the sensory data, okay? And so in this contrived example, the idea is that really only hypothesis B has both high prior probability and a high likelihood. Hypothesis A has a high likelihood but low prior probability. Hypothesis C has high prior probability but low likelihood. Okay, so this is kind of a mathematical framework for sort of thinking about probabilistic inference, the key idea being that there are these sort of two ingredients here. There's the prior, how likely different states of the world are given what we know about the world, and the likelihood, which is can the hypothesis explain the data that we observe. Okay. All right, so if we want to explain perception in this kind of way as perceptual inference, there's a lot of things that actually have to be specified. Okay, so one of the things that you have to specify is the hypothesis space. Okay. All right, so how are we actually going to define the states of the world that the perceptual system is actually trying to estimate? Okay. If we define the hypothesis space, then we also need to know the prior probability of all the different hypotheses that live in that space. We need a likelihood function, which tells us how to compare a hypothesis to the sensory input. If we've got the prior and the likelihood, that gives us the posterior. But the whole idea behind the perceptual inference is like you want to find the hypothesis that gives you a high value for the posterior. And so that means you need some way to find the hypothesis that has, say, the highest posterior probability. Okay? And in practice, that actually is often highly non-trivial, because the space of all the hypotheses may be enormous, okay? And the posterior distribution may be multimodal, so finding the value that has finding the hypothesis that has the highest posterior may be a really difficult search problem, okay? And then ultimately, if you want to understand how all this happens in the brain, we need a description of the underlying representations and of the inference in terms of neurons. All right, so there's like lots of different things that we actually really need to nail down to really say that we understand this. And these different ingredients that are here on this slide are related to this idea that there are different levels of analysis at which you can talk about an information processing problem. Okay? And the idea of there being levels of analysis was most famously articulated by somebody named David Marr, who was a vision researcher who worked here at MIT back in the 70s. He wrote a very influential book called Vision, which was sort of his view for how to study vision. And the kind of lasting contribution of that is this set of distinctions into levels of analysis that you still hear a lot about today. And you've probably heard about them in other classes. Okay? So Marr distinguished between three levels of analysis. The first, and maybe sort of the highest level, is the computational level. And that involves asking what the problem is that is being solved by the system and what the constraints are that allow that problem to be solved. Okay? So defining the problem to be solved sort of is akin to like identifying the hypothesis space. So like what is the thing that you're trying to estimate from the sensory data? So, could be the fundamental frequency, it could be like where something is coming from in the world, it could be the shape of an object, right? And it also involves like determining how you would assign probabilities to hypotheses, okay? So asserting that there's prior probability that varies over hypotheses, likelihood, and so forth. So you can also think of this computational level as nailing down the mapping between the input and the output, okay? So a computational level description of a problem defines that mapping. So it says, what are the assumptions that are being made by the perceptual system to solve this problem? And those assumptions determine the mapping between the input, say the sound or the image, and the output, which is your estimate of the property of the world that you're interested in. All right, now, then there's also the algorithmic level, which involves identifying the approach to finding the solution. Okay? And so one way to think about this, if we're thinking about probabilistic inference, is in describing an optimization procedure to find the best hypothesis or the most probable hypothesis given the sensory input. And as I said, that often involves like very hard search problems because there's a huge hypothesis space. It's not obvious like which one is the best. And then there's the level of the implementation, which is how you would instantiate a solution to a problem in hardware. And so this, in the context of neuroscience, this would involve a description of neural circuitry. So this is an excerpt of a figure from Marr's book, where these are in his words, those three levels. So there's the computational theory, the representation and algorithm, and then hardware implementation. Any questions about levels of analysis? And I should say we will return to these ideas repeatedly over the course of the class, and you'll sort of kind of think about them as being applied to lots of different aspects of perception. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk about auditory scene analysis, which you can think of as this problem of inferring sources in the world from a sound signal that reaches your ears. So as we've discussed, if we want to think about this as perceptual inference, we need to specify the hypothesis space, the prior probability of hypotheses, a whole bunch of stuff, okay? And as a starting point, let's kind of think about about these priors, right? So priors reflect the regularities of real-world sounds. So we've just seen this demonstration that the sounds that we hear in the real world are not random, right? So some sounds are a lot more likely than others. So the doorbell is the kind of thing that can occur in life. There's other things that wouldn't. Okay? And these regularities that exist in real-world sounds, they derive from the processes that generate them, right? So sounds, they're generated by lawful physical processes for the most part, right? And those are governed by physical laws, and so there's just, you can't get any old thing, right? There's certain things that can result from that. And so as with other areas of perception, illusions can tell us a lot. So illusions can reveal the constraints on sound generation that have been internalized by our brains that make auditory scene analysis possible via priors that we have on what kinds of sounds are likely and what are not. And so this is often talked about in the language of grouping cues. So we talked about cues when we were talking about sound localization, right? So remember the notion of a cue is a stimulus property that's informative about something in the world, right? So we talked about how there are binaural cues like intraoral time differences and level differences, and spectral cues from your pinna that tell you about elevation. Similarly or analogously, grouping cues are thought of as stimulus properties that are informative about the organization of sound into sources. Okay? We believe that these cues derive from statistical properties of natural sounds, and we'll talk about a number of examples. And really, like sort of two obvious examples are kind of shown here, onset and offset and harmonicity. And this is just a cochlear representation of a speech signal. And you can see that you get these patterns here where the energy begins and ends across a wide range of frequencies more or less at the same time. Right? So there's a common onset or a common offset. And that's because people open and close their mouth, and so you get like termination of energy or a burst of energy. Okay? And that common onset and offset is sort of something that happens a lot in natural sounds. And the idea is that when that is observed in the sound signal, that gives you a clue that all of those frequencies that have the same onset are caused by the same thing in the world. Similarly, we just talked about how lots of sounds in the world are harmonic, in particular sounds that are produced by our voice. Okay? And that shows up as these horizontal stripes here for individual harmonics. And so the idea is that if you observe harmonic frequencies in the input to the ear, that's a pretty strong cue that those frequencies actually came from the same source in the world. Right? Because sources in the world tend to be harmonic. Okay, and so what we're going to get into next time is a bunch of really remarkable demonstrations that give us evidence that your brain has internalized a whole bunch of these properties of sound, and it causes you to organize sound into distinct sources. Okay, and these are illusions of perceptual organization. So we'll end there. Have a great weekend. Recitation's tomorrow. Problem set is due tomorrow. I'll see you on Tuesday.